In 16th century France, the crown was not a symbol of divinity, but a prize paid for in blood and treachery. This was a realm fractured by faith, where the Catholic cross and the Huguenot Bible were symbols of a coming war. Into this cauldron of hatred and ambition stepped a woman from the Florentine house of Medici. She was an orphan, a political pawn married to a prince who did not love her. Her name was Catherine de' Medici, and she would learn that to rule is to kill. For years, she was the Florentine shopkeeper, scorned and powerless, overshadowed by her husband's mistress. But power is a patient predator, and Catherine knew how to wait in the darkness. Her wait ended in the summer of 1559, with the splintering of a lance and the scream of a king. King Henry II's death was not swift. A sliver of wood had pierced his eye and penetrated his brain. For 10 days, the palace was filled with his torment, and Catherine watched as her future was forged in his suffering. When Henry finally died, his mistress was banished, and the scorned Florentine became the most powerful woman in France. She was now the Queen Mother, regent to her frail son, King Francis II. The court that once mocked her now held its breath, sensing the arrival of a new, colder power. But her son's reign was short-lived. Francis was a sickly boy, and he soon followed his father to the grave, leaving the throne to his even younger brother, Charles IX. Catherine's regency was solidified, but the kingdom she inherited was a viper's nest of religious and political animosity. The Huguenots, French Protestants, were growing in number and influence, led by men of conviction and military might. Figures like the stern Admiral Gaspard de Coligny and the charismatic Louis, Prince of Condé, were not just religious leaders, they were rivals for the soul of France. On the other side stood the powerful and fanatically Catholic House of Guise. Led by the ambitious Duke of Guise, they saw the Huguenots as a cancerous heresy that must be carved from the body of France. They were Catherine's allies of convenience and her most dangerous rivals. Catherine, a pragmatist at heart, initially sought a path of tolerance. She tried to broker peace, to find a middle ground where both faiths could coexist. But in an age of absolutes, moderation was seen as weakness, a betrayal by both sides. The breaking point came in March 1562 in the town of Vassy. The Duke of Guise and his men discovered a congregation of Huguenots worshipping in a barn. They were unarmed men, women, and children. What followed was not a battle, but a butchering. Guise's soldiers fell upon the worshippers with swords and pikes. The sounds of prayer turned to screams of agony. The floor of the barn became slick with the blood of dozens, a grim sacrament that would ignite the French wars of religion. The massacre of Vassy ended any hope of peace. The kingdom plunged into a series of brutal civil wars. Armies marched, cities were besieged, and the French countryside was scarred by unspeakable atrocities committed by both sides. Catherine found herself navigating a storm of her own making. To survive, she played her enemies against each other, making and breaking alliances with ruthless efficiency. Her court became a web of spies, assassins, and poisoners, where a whispered word could be a death sentence. She was rumored to consult with astrologers and sorcerers, seeking glimpses of the future in the stars or in the entrails of sacrificed animals. The Black Queen, they called her, a woman who communed with dark forces to maintain her grip on the throne. Years of war bled the kingdom dry. A fragile peace was eventually negotiated, a truce held together by exhaustion rather than goodwill. To seal this peace, Catherine devised a plan of stunning political brilliance, a marriage. She would marry her Catholic daughter, Marguerite de Valois, to the leading Huguenot prince, the young and dashing Henry of Navarre. The union was meant to be a symbol of reconciliation, a wedding that would bind the warring factions together in a new era of harmony. But it was a trap. By inviting the entire Huguenot leadership to Paris for the wedding festivities, Catherine was gathering all of her enemies in one place. The city, overwhelmingly Catholic and fiercely loyal to the House of Guise, was a powder keg waiting for a spark. The Huguenot nobility arrived in their hundreds, full of cautious optimism. They walked into the capital, a city that despised them, believing the royal marriage was their shield. They were lambs, unknowingly walking into the abattoir. The atmosphere in Paris during the August wedding was thick with tension. Priests preached sermons of fire and brimstone against the heretics who now walked their streets. The common folk, whipped into a frenzy by the Catholic League, spat at the Huguenots and whispered of a divine cleansing to come. At the heart of Catherine's fear was Admiral Coligny. The old Huguenot warrior had gained a powerful influence over her son, King Charles. He was urging the young king to defy his mother and lead France into a war against Catholic Spain, a move Catherine knew would be catastrophic. Coligny had to be removed. The plan was for a simple, surgical assassination to cut the head off the Huguenot snake. An assassin was hired, a man with a long harquebus and a steady hand, to eliminate the admiral as he walked back to his lodgings. On August 22nd, as Coligny returned from a meeting at the Louvre, a shot rang out. The bullet tore through the admiral's arm and lodged in his hand. He stumbled, wounded and bleeding, but alive. The assassination had failed. Panic erupted in the Huguenot camp. Their leader had been struck down in the king's city under the king's protection. They smelled a conspiracy, a royal betrayal, and their calls for justice were laced with threats of vengeance. Catherine was now trapped. Her plan had not only failed, but had also enraged her enemies, who were now cornered and dangerous. The Huguenots swore that if the king would not give them justice, they would take it themselves, an open threat of a new, bloodier civil war starting within Paris itself. A frantic council was held at the Tuileries Palace. Catherine, along with her Italian advisors and the leaders of the Guise faction, painted a terrifying picture for the young, unstable King Charles. They told him the Huguenots were plotting to kill him and the entire royal family, to seize the throne for themselves. They argued that a preemptive strike was the only way to save the kingdom. It was not murder, they claimed, but self-preservation. All the Huguenot leaders had to be eliminated in one swift, decisive blow before they could unleash their own bloody coup. King Charles, who had been fond of Coligny, resisted. He sweated, he wept, he raged against the idea. But he was a weak-willed man, plagued by anxiety and easily manipulated by his formidable mother. Under hours of relentless pressure, he finally snapped. In a fit of fury and terror, he shrieked his consent. "Kill them," he supposedly screamed. "Kill them all, so that not one will be left to reproach me." The order was given. The die was cast. There would be no turning back. The plan was meticulous and brutal. The gates of Paris were to be locked, preventing any escape. Chains were to be drawn across the streets to hinder movement. The city militia, fueled by religious hatred, was armed and given lists of targets. Every prominent Huguenot was marked for death. The signal was to be the tolling of the bell from the church of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois near the Louvre. Its peal would echo across the sleeping city, not as a call to prayer, but as a summons to slaughter. The night of St. Bartholomew's Eve, August 24th, 1572, was to be a night of blood. The first target was the man who started it all, Admiral Coligny. The Duke of Guise, whose father had been assassinated by a Huguenot years earlier, claimed the right to oversee this personal vengeance. He led a group of assassins to Coligny's lodgings, their hearts filled with a cold and murderous resolve. They broke down the door to the Admiral's house. Coligny, still recovering from his wound, was woken by the commotion. He faced his killers with a calm dignity, telling his terrified attendants, "I have long been prepared to die." One of the assassins, a man named Bame, ran him through with a sword. Not content with a simple death, they stabbed his dying body repeatedly before throwing it from the window into the courtyard below. The Duke of Guise, waiting in the darkness, wiped the blood from the corpse's face to confirm it was him. With Coligny's death, the bell began to toll. It was the signal. All over Paris, the slaughter began. The Catholic militia, identifiable by white crosses on their hats, and mobs of ordinary citizens, drunk on wine and religious fury, swarmed into the streets. They stormed the houses of Huguenots, dragging men, women, and children from their beds. The victims were often still in their nightclothes, bewildered and terrified. They were cut down in their doorways, in their bedrooms, in the streets, with no chance to fight back. The violence was not confined to the leaders. It became an indiscriminate purge of anyone suspected of being a Protestant. The killers were driven by a toxic mix of religious zeal, personal grievances, and the simple, brutal desire to loot and plunder. Even the Louvre Palace, the king's own residence, was not a sanctuary. Huguenot nobles who had come for the royal wedding were hunted down in the palace's corridors and courtyards. The wedding feast had become a funeral banquet. The young groom, Henry of Navarre, and his cousin, the Prince of Condé, were dragged before King Charles. Their lives were spared only on the condition that they renounce their Protestant faith and convert to Catholicism on the spot. They were prisoners in a palace flowing with the blood of their friends. The streets of Paris became a vision of hell. The cobblestones ran slick with blood. The air grew thick with the stench of death and the smoke of burning buildings. The screams of the dying were a constant, horrifying chorus that lasted for 3 days. The River Seine became a mass grave. Thousands of bodies were thrown into the water, a gruesome tide of corpses that would drift for miles downstream. It was said the river ran red, a ghastly testament to the scale of the slaughter. Children were not spared. Infants were snatched from their mothers' arms and dashed against walls. Entire families were wiped out, their bloodlines erased in a single night of unimaginable cruelty. The killers showed no mercy, believing they were doing God's work. The body of Admiral Coligny was subjected to further desecration. The mob cut off his head, hands, and genitals. His torso was dragged through the streets, then hung by its feet from the public gallows at Montfaucon, a final, hideous humiliation for the Protestant hero. From a window in the palace, Catherine de Medici and her son King Charles are said to have watched the carnage. The king, who had once been so hesitant, was now reportedly caught up in the bloodlust, even taking a harquebus and firing at fleeing Huguenots across the river. The massacre in Paris lasted for 3 days, but the madness did not end there. As news of the events in the capital spread, similar slaughters erupted in a dozen other cities across France. In Orleans, Lyon, Rouen, and Bordeaux, Catholic mobs rose up and massacred their Protestant neighbors. The total death toll is impossible to know for certain. Conservative estimates place it at 5,000 in Paris and 10,000 in the provinces, but some historians argue the final number could be as high as 30,000. It was one of the single worst religious atrocities of the century. The international reaction was one of shock and horror. In Protestant England, Queen Elizabeth's court dressed in mourning. The English ambassador in Paris described witnessing scenes of such barbarity that they would forever stain the honor of France. But in the Catholic world, there was celebration. King Philip II of Spain, France's great rival and a champion of Catholicism, was said to have laughed for the only time in his life upon hearing the news. In Rome, Pope Gregory XIII ordered a Te Deum to be sung in thanksgiving. A commemorative medal was struck in Rome to honor the event. One side bore the Pope's image, while the other depicted an angel, sword in hand, slaughtering the Huguenot heretics. For the hardliners of the faith, the massacre was not a crime, but a divine judgment. For King Charles IX, the aftermath was a descent into personal hell. He was plagued by guilt and paranoia, haunted by the screams of his victims. He reportedly suffered from terrifying visions and sweated blood, his body and mind breaking under the weight of his actions. He would never recover. Less than 2 years after the massacre, Charles died of tuberculosis, a tormented and broken man. On his deathbed, he is said to have cried out to his nurse, "What blood, what murders! I am lost. I see it well." Catherine de' Medici, however, had achieved her short-term goal. The Huguenot leadership was shattered, its political power decimated. She had consolidated the crown's authority and removed the threat of Coligny's influence. But the cost was a kingdom more divided and hateful than ever before. The massacre did not end the wars of religion. It fueled them with a new and desperate ferocity. The surviving Huguenots were radicalized. They no longer fought for tolerance within the kingdom, but for survival against a monarchy that had proven itself to be murderously treacherous. Catherine's other sons would rule after Charles, but their reigns were plagued by the legacy of St. Bartholomew's Day. The monarchy was forever stained, its word and honor rendered meaningless. The cycle of assassination and warfare continued, tearing France apart for another generation. Ironically, the ultimate victor of the chaos was the man who had narrowly survived it. Henry of Navarre, the Huguenot groom, would eventually escape his Catholic captors, return to his faith, and after years of more fighting, inherit the French throne as King Henry IV. To finally bring peace to his shattered kingdom, Henry, a pragmatist like Catherine, famously declared, "Paris is worth a mass," and converted to Catholicism for a second and final time. His ascension marked the end of the Valois dynasty that Catherine had fought so brutally to preserve. Catherine de' Medici died in 1589, just months before her last son, King Henry III, was assassinated. She lived long enough to see her life's work crumble, her dynasty on the verge of extinction, and the kingdom still engulfed in the flames she had fanned. What is the final judgment on the Black Queen? Was she a monstrous tyrant, a serial poisoner, and the architect of genocide? Or was she a desperate mother and ruler, backed into a corner, using the only weapons she had, deceit and violence, to protect her children and her kingdom from disintegration? The truth is likely buried somewhere in the middle, in the grey expanse between monster and pragmatist. She was a product of a brutal age, a time when political survival was a zero-sum game played with daggers and armies. She did what she felt was necessary, and the consequences were horrific. The story of Catherine and the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre is a chilling reminder of the terrifying power of fear. It was fear that drove Catherine to conspire, fear that drove King Charles to order the killing, and fear that drove a Parisian mob to butcher their neighbors in their beds. It is a lesson written in blood, a warning of how quickly the veneer of civilization can be stripped away by religious fanaticism and political paranoia, leaving only the raw, screaming face of human brutality. In the halls of the Louvre and on the streets of Paris, hell was not a distant concept. It was a reality created by human hands.